The morning sun had barely crested the tree line when I first noticed the suspicious movement near our property's back fence, and though I wanted to dismiss it as just some neighbor walking their dog or maybe a stray animal rustling in the brush, something about the steady crunch of gravel and the faint glint of a flashlight beam told me otherwise, and sure enough, when I stepped onto the porch with my coffee mug still warm in hand, I caught sight of the familiar khaki uniforms of the HOA. Patrol officers, the self-proclaimed guardians of the neighborhood, who had, over the past year, turned our quiet homestead into their personal training ground as they sought to enforce every minor regulation with an almost military obsession, whether it was the shade of our mailbox, the angle at which Grandpa parked his old blue truck, or the supposed overgrowth of grass that never exceeded more than an inch past their arbitrary standards. But this time, they weren't content with peering from the street or snapping photos with their phones. They had actually climbed our fence again, trespassing onto private land as though it were their God-given right, their boots crunching against the damp soil as they tried to stay quiet. And I could feel the familiar heat of irritation boiling inside me, because this wasn't the first time we had caught them doing it, and every polite request, every written warning, every pointed reminder about property rights had fallen on deaf ears there. Arrogance only growing with each incident until it was clear they believed themselves untouchable. And though I was younger and perhaps more patient, my grandfather had reached the end of his rope long ago, his gruff voice echoing in the kitchen tonight before, as he declared, "If they hop my fence one more time, boy, I'm going to give them a lesson they won't forget." And judging by the determined gleam in his eyes, I knew he meant it. For Grandpa wasn't the kind of man to make idle threats, not after a lifetime of hard work on the ranch, not after building his own home with his bare hands and defending his property against coyotes, rustlers, and even storms that ripped through the valley. So when the HOA patrol thought they could treat his land like an extension of their clipboard kingdom, they had picked the wrong old man to mess with. And as I watched from the porch that morning, coffee forgotten, I realized the stage was being set for a showdown that had been brewing for months. Because Grandpa had already been tinkering in the shed the past week, gathering coils of wire, old transformers, and a set of warning signs that made me think he was planning something far more serious than a stern talking to, and when he shuffled out onto the porch beside me, leaning on his cane, but with a smirk that carried the weight of 100 battles fought and won, he muttered under his breath, "Well, son, looks like they didn't take the hint, so tonight we'll give them a little spark to jog their memory." And though I chuckled nervously at first, the fire in his eyes made it clear he wasn't joking, and suddenly I found myself torn between the absurdity of the idea, electrifying the gate like we were living in some kind of cattle farm, and the righteous satisfaction that maybe, just maybe, those patrol officers would finally learn that our property line wasn't a suggestion, but a boundary written in stone. And as the day wore on, with Grandpa disappearing into the shed, and the faint smell of solder drifting on the breeze, I began to realize that the battle between us and the HOA wasn't just about fences or grass heights anymore. It was about respect, dignity, and the right to live without being harassed on the very land you call home. That evening, as the cicadas began their steady hum and the golden light of sunset stretched across the fields, Grandpa set his plan into motion with the kind of quiet determination that only comes from decades of stubborn pride and hard-earned wisdom, and I followed him half nervous and half amused as he dragged out the old metal toolbox that had been with him since his days fixing tractors in the county repair yard, the hinges squeaking and the faint smell of motor oil and steel filling the air as he pried it open, revealing a mess of pliers, wires, clamps, and a heavy coil of insulated cable that looked like it had been salvaged from some forgotten barn, and though I questioned whether it was even safe or legal, he simply waved off my concerns with that same dismissive grunt he always gave when people underestimated him, muttering, "Boy, I've been wiring up barns and electric fences since before you were born. Don't think I don't know what I'm doing." And with that he set about stringing the cable along the top line of the gate, fastening it tightly with clamps that bit into the metal until the whole structure looked less like a welcoming entrance and more like a barrier you might see guarding a military base. And as he worked, he kept talking not just about the technical details, but about the principle behind it all, telling me stories of when he was young, how neighbors respected each other's boundaries, how folks handled disputes face to face instead of hiding behind committees and rule books, how property rights meant something back then. And his voice carried a mixture of nostalgia and simmering anger as he compared those times to now, when the HOA acted like kings lording over their subjects, issuing fines for leaving a trash can out too long or daring to repaint a front door without their blessing. And I began to understand that this gate project wasn't just about shocking a few patrol officers, it was about reclaiming a sense of independence they had been chipping away at with each ridiculous demand. So I stayed quiet and handed him tools, watching as the old man's hands, gnarled but steady, stripped wires, twisted connectors, and rigged a transformer to a hidden extension cord that he ran back to the porch where he planned to sit like a general commanding a battlefield. And though part of me wanted to call the sheriff or at least warn the patrol of what they were walking into, another part of me, the larger, angrier part, wanted to see the look on their smug faces when they realized Grandpa had outsmarted them, because they had spent too long believing the neighborhood existed solely for their control, and for once they were about to learn what it felt like to be on the receiving end of someone else's rules. So when darkness finally settled in and the crickets joined the cicadas in their chorus, Grandpa poured himself a glass of sweet tea, settled into his rocking chair on the porch, and with a mischievous glint in his eye, flipped the small switch he had mounted beside him, the faint hum of electricity vibrating through the metal of the gate as he leaned back like a hunter waiting for prey, and I, despite my protests earlier, found myself drawn into the anticipation, sitting beside him with my own drink, watching the shadows at the edge of the property where we knew, without a doubt, the HOA patrol would eventually appear because they were creatures of habit, sneaking in at least twice a week, always under the delusion that they were invisible. And as the minutes stretched into an hour, I began to think maybe they wouldn't come. Maybe they'd chosen tonight to pester some other unfortunate neighbor. But just when my eyelids began to grow heavy, Grandpa nudged me with his cane and pointed, and sure enough, two dark figures were crouched at the far corner of the fence line, their flashlights dimmed, their whispers barely audible as they prepared to scale the fence yet. Again, and though my heart pounded with a mix of fear and excitement, Grandpa didn't move, didn't even shift in his chair. He just watched with that sly grin as the first man grabbed the top rail of the gate and hauled himself up, his boots slipping slightly on the slick metal before he steadied himself and swung a leg over. And in that instant, the hum of the current did its work, a sharp crack, followed by a startled yelp cutting through the night as the man jerked violently and tumbled backward into the dirt, clutching his hand and cursing under his breath, and his partner, wide-eyed and panicked, reached out instinctively to help, only to brush against the same electrified rail and recoil with a shout that carried across the still night air. And I couldn't help it. I laughed, not cruelly, but with the kind of uncontrollable release that comes from months of pent-up frustration, and even Grandpa, stoic as he usually was, chuckled deep in his chest, rocking back and forth in satisfaction as he sipped his tea, and for a brief, glorious moment, the balance of power had shifted, because the mighty HOA patrol, the self-anointed enforcers of the neighborhood, were reduced to clumsy intruders caught trespassing where they didn't belong. And though they scrambled away quickly, muttering threats and vowing to report us, the damage was done, because now they knew that stepping onto our property came with consequences, and Grandpa, watching them retreat into the shadows, muttered with that dry humor of his, "Reckon that'll keep him on their side of the fence for a while," though I knew, deep down, this wasn't the end of the feud, but only the beginning, because people like the HOA board didn't take humiliation lightly, and if I knew them at all, they'd be back, angrier and more determined than ever. But for that one night, sitting on the porch under the wide Texas sky, I felt like we had finally won a small victory in a war that was far from over. The next morning dawned bright and crisp, with the faint smell of dew still clinging to the grass, but instead of peace, there was tension in the air, the kind of electric charge that tells you a storm is on the horizon, and sure enough, by mid-morning, the sound of tires crunching gravel announced the arrival of the HOA's white SUV, the one they used whenever they wanted to look official, complete with the association's green and gold logo plastered on the side, like some kind of government seal, and out stepped none other than Harold Jenkins, the head of the HOA board and the most self-important man within 50 miles, his chest puffed out beneath his neatly pressed polo shirt and his clipboard tucked under one arm like a sheriff's badge, his eyes scanning our property with the disapproval of a king surveying peasants who had disobeyed. And trailing behind him were two more patrol officers, the same ones who had gotten themselves zapped the night before, their faces still red. With embarrassment, their hands wrapped in bandages, glaring at our porch as though it had personally insulted them. But Grandpa didn't flinch, didn't even pause his slow ritual of sipping coffee from his chipped mug, and I stood beside him, trying to look calmer than I felt, because deep down I knew what was coming. There would be accusations, threats, maybe even a call to the sheriff. But what I didn't know was how Grandpa planned to handle it, though if his calm demeanor was any clue, he had already prepared for this exact confrontation. So when Harold stomped up the walkway and planted himself at the base of the porch steps, his voice booming with false authority as he declared, "Mr. Thompson, we have reason to believe you have installed an illegal electrical device on your property that caused injury to HOA officers last night." I expected Grandpa to growl or argue, or maybe even threaten back, but instead he leaned forward, rested his cane across his knees, and said in a slow, measured drawl, "Injury, huh? Funny thing, Harold, last I checked, trespassing on private property is still against the law in this county, so if your boys got themselves a little tingle, maybe they ought to think twice before climbing fences that don't belong to them." And the look on Harold's face was priceless, a mixture of shock and indignation, because he wasn't used to being challenged, wasn't used to someone flipping the blame right back at him, and though he tried to recover, sputtering about safety codes and liability, Grandpa cut him off with a raised hand and a voice that carried the weight of iron, saying, "You and your patrols have been harassing this family for months, poking around, taking pictures, handing out fines like candy, but last night you crossed the line. My fence is my line, and you don't climb it not unless you're invited." And I could see the two injured patrolmen shifting uncomfortably behind Harold, because deep down they knew Grandpa was right, knew they had no business sneaking onto our property under cover of darkness, and for a moment, silence hung heavy, broken only by the creak of Grandpa's rocking chair. But Harold, never one to admit defeat, jabbed his finger toward us and said, "This isn't over. We'll be filing a formal complaint, and if necessary, we'll take this matter to court." To which Grandpa chuckled softly and replied, "You do that, Harold, and I'll be filing my own complaint about trespassing, harassment, and invasion of privacy in between your little stunt last night and my security cameras that caught every second of it. I reckon the judge will have a real hard time siding with you." And when he said that, my jaw nearly dropped because I hadn't realized Grandpa had cameras set up, but sure enough, he reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out a small flash drive, holding it up between two fingers like a winning poker card, and the color drained from Harold's face as he realized he'd been outmaneuvered, the bravado slipping. For just a moment before he barked something unintelligible and turned on his heel, marching back to the SUV with his wounded patrolman scrambling behind, and as they drove off in a cloud of dust, Grandpa leaned back, grinned at me, and said, "Always keep a backup plan. Boy, electricity's good for a scare, but video proof? That's what'll keep them honest." And I couldn't help but laugh, partly out of relief and partly out of admiration, because the old man was playing chess while everyone else was fumbling with checkers. But even as I laughed, a pit of unease formed in my stomach, because if Harold and his crew were embarrassed now, they'd surely come back harder, more determined, maybe even desperate, and sure enough, the following week proved my suspicions right, as the HOA board called an emergency meeting at the community center, one where attendance was mandatory for all residents, and word spread quickly that our family was the main topic of discussion, whispers circulating that Grandpa's dangerous contraption was a threat to the neighborhood, that he had assaulted patrol officers, that we were a menace to community safety, and though I wanted to skip the circus altogether, Grandpa insisted we attend, saying, "Never let them write your story without you being in the room, so come Friday evening, we found ourselves sitting in the back row of the community center, the air thick with tension as neighbors side-eyed us, some with sympathy, others with suspicion, and Harold, standing at the front with a microphone, launched into a speech about standards and safety, painting a picture of us as rebels who endangered everyone by wiring our gate like a booby trap, and though a few people nodded along, I could see cracks forming in his performance, because not everyone was buying it, not when most folks had dealt with the HOA's pettiness at one point or another, and when Grandpa finally stood up leaning heavily on his cane but speaking with a voice strong enough to silence the room, he told the story from the beginning: the late-night patrols, the trespassing, the warnings ignored, the way they treated our land like their playground. And then he dropped the bombshell, holding up that same flash drive and declaring, "I've got video evidence of your patrols breaking into my property, climbing my fence, and getting exactly what they deserved. So if Harold here wants to take me to court, I'll be more than happy to show it to a judge." And to every neighbor who wants to see how their dues are being spent, and the murmurs that followed were loud and unmistakable, people shifting in their seats, whispering to each other. And for the first time, Harold looked like a man cornered, his usual confidence faltering as he tried to shout over the noise. But Grandpa had already won the room. Because in a neighborhood full of people tired of the HOA's overreach, our little act of defiance had struck a chord. And though the meeting eventually devolved into shouting and ended without resolution, the tide had turned. And as we walked back home under the night sky, Grandpa steady beside me, I realized the fight was no longer just ours. It had become a rallying point for everyone sick of being bullied, and whether Harold liked it or not, the war he had started was slipping out of his control. The weeks that followed were some of the most intense I can remember, a slow-burning standoff between Grandpa and the HOA that transformed our once quiet neighborhood into a battleground of petty power struggles and whispered alliances. Because after that infamous community meeting, Harold's pride had taken a hit he couldn't ignore, and he doubled down on his mission to break us, sending letters almost daily with bold red stamps screaming violation notice for absurd things like the angle of our porch light, the length of our grass after rainstorm, or even the fact that Grandpa's old pickup leaked a drop or two of oil on the driveway. But what Harold failed to realize was that the harder he pushed, the more support we quietly gathered, because neighbors who once kept their heads down now stopped by our porch in the evenings, sharing stories of their own harassment by the HOA, stories of being fined for planting the wrong kind of flowers or threatened for hanging up wind chimes. And slowly, what began as Grandpa's personal battle became a neighborhood cause, with people dropping off baked goods, offering to testify, even slipping us copies of their own violation letters to prove the board's abuses of power. And I saw a spark in Grandpa's eyes I hadn't seen in years, a fire that reminded me of the stories he told of standing his ground back in his younger days. And one evening, as we watched the sun dip low and the gate still hummed faintly with its protective current, he said, "Boy, these HOA folks think they can scare us into submission, but they forgot one thing. You don't pick a fight with a man who's got nothing left to lose and everything worth protecting." And I knew then that he wasn't going to let go until this was settled once and for all. So when the official summons finally arrived, a thick envelope declaring that the HOA was taking us to small claims court over reckless endangerment and safety hazards, Grandpa simply chuckled, slapped the papers down on the table, and said, "Good, been waiting for my turn." And the day of the trial became something of a spectacle, neighbors filling the small county courthouse just to watch, the HOA board sitting stiffly in the front row, with Harold leading the charge, puffed up like a rooster about to crow. But the moment Grandpa shuffled up to the witness stand, came tapping against the floor, the entire room quieted, because despite his age, there was something commanding about the way he carried himself. And when the judge asked for his side of the story, he laid it out plain and simple: how patrol officers had repeatedly trespassed, how warnings had been ignored, how cameras had caught them in the act, and finally, how he had installed a mild, non-lethal current to deter intruders from climbing his fence, the same way ranchers had done for generations to keep cattle in and coyotes out. And when Harold tried to interrupt with his usual bluster about community safety, the judge silenced him with a sharp rap of the gavel, then asked to see the evidence, at which point Grandpa handed over the flash drive. And as the video played on the court monitor, showing the patrol officers sneaking through the shadows before yelping and stumbling back in comic disarray, a ripple of laughter swept through the courtroom. Even the judge, hiding a smirk as he turned back to Harold and asked, "And you're claiming you were the victims here?" Which sent Harold into a sputtering rage about rules and regulations. But the damage was done because the law was clear. Our fence was private property, and the HOA had no authority to enter without permission. And when the judge dismissed their complaint outright, and even warned Harold about possible charges for harassment and trespassing if the behavior continued. The relief that washed over me was overwhelming, but it was nothing compared to the quiet satisfaction radiating from Grandpa as we walked out of that courthouse to the cheers and handshakes of half the neighborhood. Because in that moment, he wasn't just an old man fighting for his fence. He had become a symbol of resistance against the overreach that had plagued everyone, and though Harold and his cronies sulked away, plotting their next move, their power had been broken, their aura of untouchability shattered by one electrified gate and a stubborn rancher who refused to bow, and life slowly began to return to normal after that, the patrols no longer daring to climb our fence, the violation notices dwindling until they stopped altogether, and neighbors waving more warmly as they passed, some even stopping to ask Grandpa for advice on dealing with their own HOA troubles, which he gave freely, though always with the caveat, stand your ground, but do it smart, proof beats anger every time. And though the war with the HOA never truly disappeared, the battlefield shifted, with Grandpa always one step ahead, his porch once again a place of peace where he could sip tea in the evening, cane resting across his knees, the gate humming faintly in the background like a reminder of the fight we'd won. And as I sat beside him, watching the fireflies dance in the twilight, I realized that the story of our electrified gate wasn't just about shocking a couple of trespassers. It was about defending what's yours, about teaching bullies that every push is a pushback, and most of all, about legacy, because long after the wires rust and the patrols forget, their lesson, I'll still remember the sight of my grandfather rocking calmly on his porch, watching the world with a grin that said, clear as day, don't tread on me,